This is no ordinary time, and all of this presents a very difficult balancing act for the U.S., getting involved in what Russia, again, considers its own domestic affairs.
I think the rapidity with which it has moved should, frankly, be a message to Russia. And Mr. Putin should listen carefully to Ukrainians who have voiced their desire for change. So we're hoping that Russia will not see this as sort of a continuation of the Cold War. We don't see it that way. We do not believe this should be an East-West, Russia, United States. This is not Rocky IV, believe me. But we are making it clear that every country should respect the territorial integrity here, the sovereignty of Ukraine. Russia has said it will do that, and we think it's important that Russia keeps its word.
Нас постоянно пытаются загнать в какой-то угол за то, что мы имеем независимую позицию, за то, что ее отстаиваем, за то, что называем вещи своими именами и не лицемерим. Но все имеет свои пределы. И в случае с Украиной наши западные партнеры перешли черту, вели себя грубо, безответственно и непрофессионально. Россия оказалась на рубеже, от которого не могла уже отступить. Если до упора сжимать пружину, она когда-нибудь с силой разожмется. Надо помнить об этом всегда.
It's 10 a.m. on an autumn morning in Transylvania. More than 1,000 Romanian soldiers are engaged in war games. They're under the guidance of hundreds of U.S. Marines.
The smaller Miklish, we call it an APOB.
It's a routine NATO exercise in military readiness.
1 minute!
But demonstrations of force like this have taken on a new urgency for the West. Here, beside the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, these soldiers are training for battle. Just a 7-hour drive from Ukraine, where Russian-backed separatists set off the worst confrontation between Moscow and the West since the end of the Cold War. Romanians and other Eastern Europeans who remember Russia's past aggressions are worried about the West's ability and willingness to stop an emboldened Russian President Vladimir Putin.
A new Cold War is a reality. Now we live in a new Cold War, but it's a danger for the real war.
Not everyone shares the former Romanian president's fears that Moscow and the West are bound for armed conflict. And yet an escalating military presence on both sides has left little room for error. The stakes of this new Cold War are about more than just territory and influence. They're also about money. Here on the top of the world, the battle is being fought over energy. The Arctic is home to 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and a third of its natural gas. To get a first-hand look, I headed north, way north, to the northernmost town in the world, on an island in the high Arctic called Svalbard. Many nations, including Russia, are eyeing this once sleepy coal mining settlement as a strategic base in this new Arctic frontier. But energy isn't the only factor in the battle for the high north. It's also about who controls the high seas, which are increasingly accessible because of global warming. New shipping lanes created by the melting of ice in the Arctic could save a lot of money. For example, a cargo ship traveling between Western Europe and Asia typically sails through the Suez Canal. Doing it this way through the Arctic shortens that trip by 40%. Melting ice in the Arctic. It's an ironic contrast to the new freeze in relations between Russia and the West. A freeze that's steadily putting old Cold War enemies on a path toward a new round of battles, whose endgame is less about ideology and more about economic control and financial supremacy. Ali Velshi, Al Jazeera, inside the Arctic Circle in Longyearbyen, Svalbard.
You've met Mr. Putin many times, and you've seen NATO evidence of Russian involvement in Ukraine. In your assessment, what is the Russian president's ambitions? What does he want?
Well, I think this goes well beyond Ukraine. It's part of a bigger master plan to restore a Russian zone of influence in the near neighborhood covering the former Soviet space. And therefore, the Russians want to keep their neighbors weak and dependent on Russia and prevent them from seeking Euro-Atlantic integration in the European Union and NATO. And that's why we see these conflicts not only in Ukraine but also in Moldova and Georgia.
Russia would probably argue it's NATO, it's the West that's breaking promises, edging closer to their borders, prodding, being the aggressor in this former sphere of influence. I mean, what would you say to that?
Such promises have never been given for the very reason that it is a fundamental principle that each and every nation has an inherent right to decide its security policy and alliance affiliation herself. Actually, all OSCE countries, including Russia, subscribed to that principle back in 1999. So it's for Ukraine, it's for Georgia and all other countries to decide whether they will seek integration with the European Union and NATO or not.
But if Russia crosses a so-called red line, what happens if there is some stirring up, say, in one of the Baltics, a NATO member? There's that collective security trigger. An attack against one is an attack against all. Do you really honestly think that a Cold War type showdown between East and West in Europe is likely? No one really wants that. No one can afford it, probably.
No one wants that, but actually the current crisis holds many features similar to what we saw during the Cold War. As regards NATO member states, no doubt that our collective defense it's strong. We are determined to defend any ally against any attack, and if the Russians were to attack a NATO ally, that would be crossing a red line. We would invoke Article 5 and defend that ally.
And do you think that is likely? I mean, you've spoken about spearhead forces, rapid reaction forces, but in reality, beyond the politics, do you think there is a likelihood of NATO forces clashing with Russian forces?
I hope not, and I think the best way to avoid that is to ensure that we have a strong deterrence so that we can deter any potential aggressor from attacking a NATO ally. And this is the reason why NATO at the summit in Wales in September decided to establish a very rapid reaction force, a spearhead force that can be deployed at very short notice, for instance in the Baltic states or anywhere in the East, if our allies are threatened.
It's an image from the Cold War, a Russian warplane flying along a NATO border, testing the West. But this fully armed Russian fighter jet was filmed just weeks ago above 3 nervous NATO countries. NATO planes are busy. They scramble and track the Russians. Their missions have tripled in a year from their base in Lithuania, which fears it could be the next target of Russian aggression. NATO is taking no chances. US troops from the 2nd Cavalry Regiment are now based in Lithuania. This, a war game with local soldiers simulating conflict with a hostile neighbour. This show of force is aimed squarely at Russia. NATO is drawing a red line here with a message to Moscow: if you try to cause trouble here or try to invade, this is what you'll get. The question is Russia listening? You're ready for any threat?
Yeah, we're trying to train and to be ready for any threat.
Many in NATO believe Russia's real aim is not just to test the alliance, but to split and destroy it.
This shows that the U.S. is willing to stand with all of its NATO alliance partners. It shows that we're strong, Europe is strong, and there's a collective defense ready to defend against any foreign aggression.
And Lithuania doesn't trust Vladimir Putin.
We cannot trust anything what they say, not a single word.
Lithuania, once ruled by Moscow, doesn't want to be again.
What's happening now, it's not just about us, about security of our continent.
Lithuania has just reintroduced the military draft. Even school children in the Baltic nations are being prepared for the possibility of invasion. NATO warplanes scramble almost daily. Its leaders warn of a real and present danger from Russia, a danger greater now than at any time since the end of the Cold War.
If there is a new Cold War, then this could be the place where the spy movie is set. It's Europe's farthest outpost. On this side of the river is Estonia, on the other side is Russia, and that river wouldn't stop an invading army for very long. Estonia is nearly 400 times smaller than Russia. It has a navy of 4 ships and an air force of 2 transporter planes. The border town of Narva is entirely Russian-speaking. Many in NATO believe a spurious defence of their rights could justify Russian military action here. So Estonia has become a new fast response base for NATO, with Estonian soldiers being trained and fighter jets at the airbase. The government says there was no alternative.
When Putin senses a vacuum, he rushes to fill it. When he sees weakness and indecision, I think he will try to exploit it. When he sees strength and unity, he will be deterred.
But NATO's justification of its defence of Estonia has produced some very high-profile critics. Among them, Rein Mullerson, the Estonian who, as aide to Mikhail Gorbachev, engineered Estonia's independence from the Soviet Union. Given that place in modern Estonian history, his criticism of NATO is highly significant.
This is a kind of provocation for Russia. I don't think that it is provocation enough for Russia to attack Estonia, but it doesn't increase Estonia's security, certainly, because there is no way that Russia is going to attack Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania for that matter, because it is not in Russia's interest.
And what about all those Russians in eastern Estonia? Do they see themselves as suffering like the Russians of Ukrainian Crimea? No, they do not.
They feel part of the European Union and believe solutions to their problems will come from Europe. They're looking for answers from Brussels, not Moscow.
The question then is whether NATO's actions here might drive pro-European Estonian Russians towards Moscow. In just a few days' time, American and other NATO soldiers will be parading in this square, literally on the Russian border, in celebration of Estonia's National Day of Independence. Many Western leaders, of course, accused Vladimir Putin of paranoia over NATO's eastward advance, but it's not difficult to imagine what the reaction would be like in a place like Washington if Russian troops tried to stage the same sort of celebration on the border with the United States of America. Politicians here talk about whether their country might be betrayed to the Russians over the river by rogue elements in the east of the country. If it's not paranoia, then it's certainly outright suspicion. It isn't at all clear if NATO's presence will make things better or worse. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera, on the Estonia-Russia border.
So is Vladimir Putin trying to start a new Cold War? I'm joined now by Jonathan Sanders, the Associate Professor, Stony Brook University School of Journalism, and Philip Mudd, CNN counterterrorism analyst and former CIA counterterrorism official. Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies at Princeton University and NYU, has written an article in The Nation about the ongoing conflict. I suggest you read it. It is very eye-opening. So, Philip, as Sarah just reported, U.S. intelligence shows that at any moment Russians are ready to transfer more powerful weapons into Ukraine, including tanks, armored vehicles, rocket launchers. In the face of world condemnation, Putin is escalating tensions. What is he up to?
I tell you, one of the things he's doing is thumbing his nose at us. When you're an intelligence professional, after 70 years of post-World War II intelligence collection against first the Soviets and now the Russians, collecting this type of intelligence information is not that difficult. Big weapons systems, when the United States has a lot of intelligence capability, collecting this information, you know, 10 days ago we're speculating on what the Russians were doing with a missile system that shot down an airplane. Now the Russians are saying, forget about it. Game on. We're sending stuff across the border, and we don't care whether you see it or not.
I want to play part of an interview with the former president of Georgia today, and I want to remind our viewers that Russia invaded Georgia back in 2008, still controls 20% of its territory. Here's what the former president said about Vladimir Putin.
I think he believes it, that he has to take revenge for what he regards as the United States defeating Soviet Union and Russia in Cold War. And then he always said that he would undermine NATO and destroy NATO, and the surest way for it is to continue his aggressive actions towards the Baltic countries. So he has been lying all the way through, but he has never been lying about his main goals.
So do you think he can undermine NATO with these actions, Philip Mudd?
I think he can undermine NATO depending on what Washington does, what the Europeans do. The Europeans, I think, have been quite slow to respond. The problem is, if you look at the variety of security problems we have today, that is going from Afghanistan through the rise of ISIS in Iraq, now a NATO problem in Western Europe, with an American public that says we're not interested in intervention overseas anymore, it's hard to sit here and say, what are we going to do if we've got to put up or shut up, with Putin saying, forget about the shoot down of the aircraft, I'm in for a dime, in for a dollar. And I think that's what he's saying.
You know, Stephen, you said on this program earlier this week, and you know, I've been thinking about it a lot, that we are dangerously close to war with Russia, given today's developments. Are we one step closer, you think?
We are deep in a new Cold War, and it's getting harder and harder to get out of it. The likelihood, particularly if new sanctions are applied, and it's very hard to remove sanctions, that this Cold War will now affect the next generation. How close are we to actual war? Here is the scenario. Any Russian leader must protect Eastern Ukraine, must protect it from this bombardment. If Putin sends weapons or aircraft to do it, NATO may enter Western Ukraine, either on the ground or in the air. That would be done, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all bets would be off. This is the most serious crisis, international crisis, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're in a fog of war. We're getting misinformation from Moscow, from Kiev, from Washington. I don't know how Mr. Mudd, a professional intelligence officer, can make these sweeping assertions when no information has been released and not even the intelligence agencies are saying publicly, or even the State Department, what he's saying. I mean, we have to be careful and get our facts straight, or we're going to kill a lot of people based on false information.
Philip?
Look, I'm not saying there's not two sides of the story, and I'm not saying that we only represent what we view from the West as an incursion by the Russians. I suspect there's been a wide variety of attacks on civilians by the Ukrainians. All I'm saying is, if you think it's difficult to collect intelligence against Russian big military systems in eastern Ukraine, it ain't. I'm not defending what the Ukrainians are doing. I'm not defending what Europe or Washington.
Do you know who shot? Do you know who shot down that airplane? Do you know who shot down that airplane?
No, I don't.
Thank you. Thank you. That's the point. That's the point. We're racing to war.
What is the point?
The point is that
I didn't say anything about war. What I said was from an intelligence perspective.
Could I get 2 cents in
Russian
here?
Military moves is simple.
Okay, go ahead, Jonathan.
Look, I think the point is, the problem is exactly what Saakashvili said, although I never agree with him. The problem's NATO. The problem is NATO. The problem is that the presidents, the two, Baby Bush and Bill Clinton, betrayed the promise that James Baker and President Bush Sr. made to the Russians about not expanding NATO. If we try and step back from this crisis and think creatively and think, what can we do to stop this warlike, dangerous situation? I'm not sure I think it's as critical as Steve, but that's a degree of nuance. Maybe we need to think of a different scenario. The United States and the Soviet Union both occupied Austria. Austria is now part economically of Europe, but is not part of NATO. Maybe we need some kind of guarantee. That's the way Ukraine has to go. Okay. Is the United States going to go to war to defend Ukraine? I don't think so.
Okay, that's going to have to be the last word. And what a way to start our Friday night with a heated debate on national television and international now. We're being simulcast around the world. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. Jonathan Sanders, Philip Mudd, Stephen Cohen.
So is Russia violating the Budapest Memorandum of 1994? Well, the first question is, what was that memorandum? The Budapest Memorandum said that Ukraine would give up all its nuclear weapons, and it had the third largest stockpile in the globe at that time, and it was getting assurances of security, of territorial integrity that were being assured by the United States, by Great Britain, and by Russia. By any measure, Russia has violated Ukraine's territorial integrity by going into Crimea, by having troops inside other parts of Ukraine. But at the same time, experts will also say that, well, the United States and Great Britain also gave guarantees there to help protect Ukraine. So in part, they have failed.
Over the past 2 months, we have watched what has looked like a minor version of the Cold War between the West and Russia. Many people are wondering, how did we get here? Was this confrontation inevitable, or did the West mishandle Russia from the start? In the mishandling camp is Jack Matlock, former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, who watched from Spaso House in Moscow as Mikhail Gorbachev presided over the end of the Cold War and then the end of communism. He argues, as the title of his recent Washington Post essay puts it, the United States has treated Russia as a loser since the end of the Cold War. In the years right after the Cold War ended, several American statesmen and writers urged a more generous policy toward Moscow. I was one of them. My logic was fairly simple. We have had two historic experiments with peace settlements after world wars. After World War I, the victors punished Germany and left it outside the new international system. It proved to be a disaster, leaving a wounded and angry Germany pining for revenge. After World War II, on the other hand, the United States and its allies were magnanimous towards Germany and Japan, integrating those countries into the new global order. That peace, the peace of 1945, succeeded brilliantly. And so I thought we should do our best to try to integrate Russia into the structures of the new post-Cold War world, give it significant aid, and help it rebuild its economy and society. Now, Western countries did provide some help, but not really on the scale that a vast country like Russia needed after the complete collapse it had gone through in the early 1990s. But if the West did not do enough, Russia also pursued policies that made integration very hard. By the early 1990s, Moscow had launched a ferocious war against Chechnya, a part of Russia that had been seeking independence from Moscow for more than a century. Estimates vary, but many believe that the Russian army killed over 200,000 people in the First and Second Chechen Wars. Meanwhile, in Europe, Moscow was ardently defending Serbia's Slobodan Milosevic as he massacred Bosnians and later Kosovars. This is not how Germany and Japan behaved after World War II as they sought integration. And at home, Russians were quickly developing a prickly resistance to outside interference, and Russian politicians who urged integration with the West became marginal figures with tiny followings. Looking at this record, the historian Anne Applebaum has argued, also in the Washington Post, that the West fundamentally misunderstood Russia. It saw the place as a quasi-Western land. Think of Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky, a Western country in the making, if only we had put forward the right policies. In fact, she argues, Russia derives its identity from being a non-Western country, perhaps even from being an anti-Western country, in the sense that it is distinct and different from the West. Perhaps the West could have done more to help Russia, but it does appear to me, looking back, that the Russia of the late 1980s and early 1990s, of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, may have been a special conciliatory moment in its history, a time when Russia was weak, its leadership enlightened, and its populace worn out by decades of communist failure. The mood of that country changed quickly as oil prices rose in the 1990s, the Russian economy grew, and the Russian state reasserted itself. In Russia, there has always been a great debate, at least since the 1840s, between Westernizers and Slavophiles. The Westernizers wanted Russia to become Western, while the Slavophiles felt that its destiny lay in its distinctive Slavic civilization that was different from the West. Today, at least, it looks like the Slavophiles were right.
Oh, I think his goal is not that hard to understand. What he's trying to do right now is to disrupt and to disrupt the political processes in eastern Ukraine, and hopefully, from his point of view, in Ukraine as a whole. He wants to make it impossible to hold elections by the end of this month when they're supposed to be presidential elections. And he wants to establish that these regions are somehow not a normal part of Ukraine. And he's doing that using Russian commandos and using Ukrainians who've been trained to play this disruptive role. And right now he's succeeding.
If we go a little bit back in time, were you surprised that he had the nerve to go into Crimea?
I was surprised by Crimea because of the speed with which it happened. And I was surprised by the speed with which the mood in Moscow changed so fast. And I was surprised by the change in tone of Russian television and media, which all happened very quickly.
Is there a risk that he will do the same trick in the Baltic states?
Yeah, I think there's a risk. I mean, again, you know, the way Putin thinks, and it's the way that Soviet users used to think, that is, you know, he will take what he can get. In other words, if he can succeed in eastern Ukraine, then he may try the same trick or the same set of tactics in the Baltics as well. These are all tactics he's used before, and actually the Soviet Union used before. What's being done now in eastern Ukraine is very similar, actually, to the way that communist takeovers were organized in 1945. Just after the war. You know, there's a team of people who now know how to do this kind of warfare, and they could be sent to the Baltic states. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but if there's no resistance from the West, and if there's no opposition to this kind of warfare, then I think it's possible he could do it, yes.
And talking about that, I mean, are you impressed by the policies of the EU, NATO, and the US?
To be fair to the EU and NATO and the US, they were taken surprise by the speed of this change, and they didn't have a set of policies in place. The test now is really, can the EU and the United States together begin to come up with a comprehensive strategy? I don't mean a few little sanctions and picking out a few friends of Putin's who are not allowed to travel to the West anymore, but a comprehensive strategy to rethink the role of NATO in Europe, to rethink Europe's energy policy, to rethink what really is our strategy as a Western alliance against Russia.
You wrote for The Economist. One of the writers for The Economist is Edward Lucas, a journalist who recently wrote that this situation is so explosive that it could eventually lead maybe to the Third World War.
Yes, it's true that if the EU and the West don't think about this strategically, if they can't come up with a way of channeling their foreign policy resources and their economic resources into rebuilding the Western alliance, then yes, it will be a very, very dangerous moment in Europe.
Yeah. You are born in the US, you live in London, but you are a Polish citizen. Are people afraid that this could spill over to Poland?
Look, you know, people in Poland look at what's happening and they feel like they've seen this movie before. They've seen this happen before. As I say, the pattern of events, the way in which the Russians are using, you know, Russian commandos to guide and organize dissatisfied young thuggish men in order to do this kind of surreptitious takeover. This is what happened in their country. So of course, when they see it, it makes them nervous. And yes, they do fear that the Baltics are next and then them.
It's not even that long ago that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton reset the relationship with President Putin. And everybody thought that it was a hunky-dory relationship and everybody could be friends. Has Putin been totally misunderstood or even underestimated?
I think that reset was a great misunderstanding. The reset was based on the premise that you can start over again. You know, that we can all forget about policies that have happened and we can begin from scratch. That's not, that's how the United States thinks, because every time we elect a new leader, then, we think we can have a new foreign policy. But that's not how the rest of the world thinks, and it's certainly not how the Russians think. Putin has been saying very clearly really since he was the head of the secret services of the FSB in the 1990s, what his views are, how he sees the world, how, the disaster that was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the desire to regain power for Russia, and not just to regain it in an economic sense or in a moral sense or in a political sense, but to regain territory and land and control. He defines power in a very 20th century way. Power is control over territory. What is Russia doing? It's trying to undermine the European post-war and post-Cold War consensus. What was the point of annexing Crimea? The point was to say, all of your rules, your ideas about the unchangeability of borders, all of that is rubbish, and I'm not going to pay attention to it anymore. And so his real goal is to undermine and delegitimize and destroy Europe. And he's been saying that he wants to do that, and he's been acting towards doing that for many years. It just became more dramatic in the last few months.
This doesn't sound like you expect a quick fix in this crisis.
No, it's not. It can't have a quick fix. It's a permanent change in the state of events in Europe. The idea that Europe now has on its border a country which wants to undermine Europe and doesn't admire Europe and doesn't want European institutions to survive, that's something it's going to take us a long time to get used to.
Anne Applebaum in London, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would it be fair to say that with regard to Russia, your policy has been pretty effective in imposing real costs on the Russian economy, but it has not deterred Vladimir Putin from creating instability in Ukraine? The conflict seems to have even escalated in the last few weeks.
I think that's entirely fair. And I think that is a testament to the bad decisions that Mr. Putin is making on behalf of his country. You think about where we've been in terms of U.S.-Russian relations. When I came into office, we talked about reset, and I established, I think, an effective working relationship with Mr. Medvedev. And as a consequence, Russia's economy was growing. They had the opportunity to begin diversifying their economy. Their relations across Europe and around the world were sound. They joined the WTO. With assistance from us. And since Mr. Putin made this decision around Crimea and Ukraine, not because of some grand strategy, but essentially because he was caught off balance by the protests in the Maidan and Yanukovych then fleeing after we had brokered a deal to transition power in Ukraine. Since that time, this improvisation that he's been doing has gotten him deeper and deeper into a situation that is a violation of international law, that violates the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, has isolated Russia diplomatically, has made Europe wary of doing business with Russia, has allowed the imposition of sanctions that are crippling Russia's economy at a time when their oil revenues are dropping. There's no formula in which this ends up being good for Russia. The annexation of Crimea is a cost, not a benefit to Russia. The days in which conquest of land somehow was a formula for great nation status is over. The power of countries today is measured by your knowledge, your skills, your ability to export goods, to invent new products and new services, your influence, and none of those things are provided by his strategy. Now, but what is absolutely true is that if you have a leader who continually drives past the off-ramps that we've provided, given the size of the Russian military, given the fact that Ukraine is not a NATO country, and so as a consequence, there are clear limits in terms of what we would do militarily. Mr. Putin has not been stopped so far. To those who would suggest that we need to do more, what I've said to them is that we can exact higher and higher costs, and that's exactly what we're doing, and we can bring diplomatic pressure to bear. I don't think that it would be wise for the United States or the world to see an actual military conflict between the United States and Russia. What we are doing is reinforcing those border states who are members of NATO and making very clear that that line is one that cannot be crossed, because we would have to take military action to protect our allies. That's part of what Article 5 is all about.
But you've seen no indication that Putin is ready for a deal in recent months, weeks?
So far what we've seen is a lot of talk in public with Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande and ourselves, in which he will say one thing, but his actions tell another tale. And what we've consistently seen is that the separatists are Russian-financed, Russian-trained. Their strategy comes from Russia. Russian troops support them. And so we have not yet seen a recognition on the part of the Kremlin that it is in Russia's interests to resolve this issue over the long term. So in addition to continuing to exact costs on Russia, one of the most important things we can do is to continue to support the Ukrainian economy and the reform efforts that are coming out of Kiev. And to their credit, President Poroshenko and Prime Minister Yatsenyuk have initiated significant reforms there that are making a difference if they're given a chance. And so I'm not wildly optimistic at this point that his orientation changes, partly because the one thing that's been very successful for Mr. Putin is his politics. I think he's been able to create, in part because of state-sponsored media and Russia TV and all the mechanisms he has to quell dissent inside his country, and tapping into sort of the strong nationalism that exists inside of Russia. What he has been able to do is to keep his poll numbers up. And in fact, a lot of his turn away from re-engagement with the West was when he decided to start running for re-election, and his popularity wasn't as high as he was accustomed to. And you'll recall there were protests in Moscow that started numbering in the thousands, and you started then seeing a ramp up of this anti-Western, anti-U.S. Rhetoric, which is out of the old Soviet playbook. So he's looking backwards, not forwards, and perhaps over time he changes his mind. In the meantime, we just have to make sure that we're firm in protecting our allies and supporting the principles that have maintained peace in Europe for the entire post-war period.
Saturday morning here in Moscow, and thousands of people have taken to the streets to condemn the Ukrainian government. They're very much pro the eastern Ukrainian rebels, very much pro Vladimir Putin, and very much against the American government.
The rally was called in support of rebels in the east of Ukraine and to show that Putin has the support of the nation, and he does. Recent polls show that Putin has an incredible 85% approval rating. Apart from a vocal, westernized, wealthier elite in the big cities, most of the country is broadly supportive of Putin's policies.
Путине? Понимаете, это человек, которому верит большая часть России, абсолютно большая часть России, да? Поэтому, что бы я ни думал лично о нем, я в первую очередь исхожу из того, что тот народ, среди которого я живу, Путина любит. Поэтому я исхожу из этого. Я не могу, как военный человек, я не могу. Весь народ любит, а я его не люблю, да? Я с большим уважением к нему отношусь, считаю его крупным политическим деятелем, лидером, уважаемым не только внутри страны, но и вовне. Поэтому это достойнейший политик, крупный политик, масштабный, умный политик. Его, так сказать, народ уважает.
Instead of blaming Putin for Russia's ills, the people at this rally blame the West for attacking them through sanctions. And they blame the Ukrainian government for what was happening in Ukraine. They also feared that the West was trying to mount a coup against Putin's government.
So why are you here?
Потому что мы не хотим, чтобы нашу страну развоплотили, уничтожили. Потому что мы гордимся своей страной, потому что мы готовы защищать ее. Защищать причем на всех фронтах. Современная в 21 веке.
Who do you think is going to attack you? America? What?
А как вы думаете, а кто может напасть на Россию? Америка? На Россию никто напасть не может, потому что вся история России – это когда на нее кто-то приходит, а потом очень жалеет об этом.
On the screen were images invoking the memory of the massacre in Odessa, Ukraine last year, where 46 mainly pro-Russian activists were burnt to death or shot. The event received little attention in the West, but in Russia it serves to galvanize the crowd against the West and the Ukrainian government.
Well, very sad. Russians consider the West to be their enemy, or they think the West has Russia as their enemy. And the United States is number one in this list.
One of the reasons for Putin's recent jump in popularity, and a reason for Russia's recent surge in nationalism, was Crimea rejoining Russia, an event condemned in the West but celebrated in Russia itself.
Crimea is basically like, if you take Ukraine from like strategical point of view, Crimea represents like 70% of the whole value. It's the key region. If you control it, you control the whole Black Sea militarily. Plus, it has very big psychological importance because of its place in Russian history, and there are 2 million of Russians who are like, it's not like in Donbass, they're just Russians.
Today is Army Day here in Russia. Across the country, events are put on to celebrate the achievements of the Russian armed forces. And this year, there's a special poignancy as once again, war has started in Europe.
The Ukrainian war began early last year. The democratically elected President Viktor Yanukovych was overthrown by protesters in Kiev. The US aided his downfall to the tune of $5 billion.
The first side which acted and created a situation of great, general lawlessness were European Union and United States, who did overthrow the government, which they themselves considered to be democratic, and in this situation we had to protect our interests.
As a fiercely pro-Western and anti-Russian government was set up in Kiev, Russia protected its interests and Crimea became Russian again. Then many in the east of Ukraine rose up. Russia aided these rebels. The Ukrainian government, with Western backing, then tried to suppress the rebellion, sending in the military. War has raged on and off since, and has almost become a proxy war between Russia and the West. The US now wants to arm the Ukrainian army.
Everybody knows this is coming to quite an intense proxy battle between NATO, EU forces, the US, and Russia on the other side, basically, and the history behind it. All the rest is well known now.
You spoke of the West there. I mean, just how much do you expect any adventurism by the West, in particular by the United States, in this truce period?
I do not expect the United States to change its posture whatsoever, unfortunately. I think there is a commitment to continue the violence, the destabilization in Ukraine, and if it falls apart, weapons will directly be sent to the United States, which from a Russian perspective will be a direct threat and almost an act of war. I mean, it is a proxy battle here, but that would be, you know, equating to that, as well as all these rapid strike forces from NATO heading to the Baltics, Poland, Hungary, and other areas. I mean, this is intensifying some very heavy tension, and it could be a slippery slope to a much broader conflict that could draw a lot of forces in.
Это даже не армия. Это иностранный легион.
в данном случае иностранный натовский легион, который, конечно, не преследует цели национальных интересов Украины. Там совсем другие цели, связанные они с достижением геополитических целей сдерживания России, что абсолютно не совпадает с национальными интересами украинского народа. Потом, когда натолкнулись на сопротивление, прекратили боевые действия, использовали, к сожалению, мирную передышку исключительно для перегруппировки, опять начали, вот сейчас опять начали. Ну, 1000 людей уже погибли. Это, конечно, реальная трагедия.
The war has brought growing militarism into the consciousness of many in Russia. In the park, patriotic songs were played, children played with old weaponry from World War II, and competitions were held.
Every year in this park, they have a sledging competition where people will dress up in funny costumes and slide down this slope. But this year, it's a little bit different. They've renamed it Battle Sledges, and the theme, alien invasion. Is this just a coincidence, or is this symptomatic of a new psychology in Russia, that a war has begun and that foreigners want to invade the country?
Russians feel under threat, but instead of being scared, they seem to be reveling in their often victorious military past.
Because the immunity of Russians towards the warfare has disappeared, and Russians as a community, they are militant in their spirit at the moment. It doesn't mean that they all want to take the rifle and go there. No, not at all. But they are, greeting the militant declarations from the side of our leaders and all that.
Cold War 2.0, do you think that's begun, or do you think it will begin?
In my opinion, it began, maybe even in the last year. Well, even just like in besieged fortress. We are now isolationists.
The majority of Westerners may believe that Russia and its leader Putin are the aggressors in this new Cold War, but in Russia the opposite is true.
And do you feel the Americans and the Europeans are trying to attack Russia somehow?
Россия не слабое существо, которое можно обидеть просто походя. Поэтому все понимают, что Россия может за себя постоять, у России есть, так сказать, свои возможности, но это учитывая, что уже был большой исторический опыт. Напасть на Россию пусть попробует еще кто-нибудь. Попадали. И Наполеон нападал, и Гитлер нападал. Ну, пусть повспоминают, где сейчас.
We should revisit the decision that President Obama made when he came into office with regard to the missile defense systems in Poland and the Czech Republic. Vladimir Putin doesn't want to act like a responsible world leader. Instead, he still wants to act like a schoolyard bully. And so with that regard, I believe that we should revisit our decision there and really reapproach those countries and offer our support for missile defense in those countries, because that missile defense will also be protection for not only us, our interests, but also Europe.
Russians also fear that the US is moving its military closer and closer to Russia's borders. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the EU has been slowly expanding eastward, and with it, the US has been constructing military bases in Eastern European countries. They say they are not set up to threaten Russia, but it's difficult to see what else they are there for.
How are Germany and France viewed? Are they viewed differently than America?
Yes, they do. They are. What they do is not what they want to do. They are compelled by United States to do that. And they even think that Angela Merkel is blackmailed by Americans, and so she has to do what they urge them, what they urge her to do.
Russia expected Germany to be much more independent player in this issue. It seems that clearly the Americans have some kind of leverage over Germany we don't know about, and probably even many other European governments don't know about. We don't even know if it is a leverage over Germany or...
Простые люди в любой стране, в Евросоюзе, там, в Германии, во Франции, в Испании, в Америке, они против войны. Любой нормальный человек против войны. Но есть люди, для которых война – это прежде всего деньги, это набитые карманы, это миллиарды. И история уже говорила об этом. И вот именно эти люди стравливают людей.
Americans, they don't basically care about the long-term consequences on the ground. They're far away and they have very limited economic relations with Russia and almost no trade with Ukraine, and they basically don't care. For them, it's just a place to re-establish their global leadership role, play politics, punish Russia, and so on. The Europeans, they will live with consequences of this war for decades.
Here in this graveyard of statues, there's a real sense of the past, of the communist era, of the Cold War. But as nationalism rises in Russia once again, there's now a new movement to take some of these statues back to the center of the city where they once stood.
Nobody is saying, stop it, or this is insane, this is rubbish. Since our media, they do produce these kind of things in huge quantities, and our politicians, they have a sort of a competition between themselves. Who will say worse words about? It is in a bit, it is childish, and I would say it's a kind of a kidding if it was not somewhere near the red button and the rockets.
Recently, for the first time, Russia overtook the US in having more nuclear weapons. An academic fact may be, as both sides still have enough weapons to destroy the other many times over. I asked Vasily what would happen if the two sides went to war now.
If there are some NATO troops attacking Russia, they would use Eastern Europe as their base. There will be airfields, logistic centers. So I would think that there would be limited nuclear strike against
bases, army,
military units and bases in places like Poland. Will anyone start Armageddon because of Poland? Not necessarily. Or because of some Lithuania.
Vasily had a warning for Eastern European countries which were ready to sign up to NATO and to allow US bases on their territory.
When these countries are aspiring to become NATO frontline states, well, they can get additional attention, additional funding, but if something major happens, then they discover that they made a very bad bargain. They basically doomed themselves.
At the end of Army Day in Moscow, we went to a hill overlooking the city to watch a fireworks display. Russians watching the show with their families and loved ones look no different than Westerners watching fireworks in their own countries. But as many agree, there is now a new Cold War between Russia and the West. What happens and how long it will last is yet to be seen.
International newspapers with Nicholas Rushworth. Hello there once again.
Hi to you, Catherine.
And we're going to be looking at the Cold War, 25 years on. This, of course, after the commemorations of the fall of the Berlin Wall yesterday.
Let's go to Bild, which is another of the big German papers, and it's got a photo album of the Berlin Fall of the Wall Jubilee. And among the photos there, we can see Angela Merkel looking at the Soviet leader of 25 years ago, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the whole question of German unification really centre stage. She's saying thank you to Mikhail Gorbachev for making it possible, for letting things happen.
Absolutely, yeah. She, of course, was an East German. He was the last Soviet leader, like you say. And very interesting to see what Mikhail Gorbachev said in Berlin at the weekend. He said that the world is on the brink of another Cold War.
And that's certainly a comment that stands out. It's the one that's making a lot of the press talk anyway. Let's go to the Daily Telegraph in the UK. They're saying a new Cold War. And there's no question mark, is there,
No.
Catherine? It seems to be very much de facto. Now, it's saying that is how Gorbachev sees it, and also Vladimir Putin. What we've got is perhaps an argument that 25 years ago, when people surged through the Brandenburg Gate, perhaps the West went too far in somehow humiliating Russia, and that sowed the seeds of some kind of feeling, certainly with Putin, that he should reconquer territorial losses. For a contradiction to that, or for a deeper analysis, let's go to The Guardian, which has this piece asking, is there a new Cold War? And concluding, well, yes, there is. Gorbachev has got it right. But the sad thing for the planet is that there are no ideas at stake. It's not about left and right or about
big
calm
ideologies.
Yes, exactly. What we've got here, and it's quite a long list of what this new Cold War could be about, but basically it comes down to who is the most rapacious and the least honest, adding that depressingly in a new Cold War scenario, both sides might be right, might have some argument to make.
Very striking image there of the blue American, I would say, eagle attacking the red Russian bear. What are we hearing then from the Russian bear?
Well, the Moscow Times, I turned to them and they have a piece saying that, well, in fact, Putin may want to have a new world order, but there isn't one. We've got no anti-Pax Americana. His idea of international reality with Russia being powerful and there being geopolitical parity is something that is only for Russian television. It's not the case.
Welcome back to Sputnik. Bombers in the Channel, warships off the coast, Britain's front line being redrawn in Latvia. If you believe the British media and some government ministers, it is only a matter of time before the Red Army, complete with snow on their boots, turn up on a high street near you. How hot is the new Cold War going to get? That is the question. Helping us answer it is The Guardian's associate editor, Seamus Milne. Seamus, thanks for joining us. NATO are not very happy with you for pointing out a contrary view to this dominant narrative which we now have in this country, which seems to be reaching almost hysterical levels, that the Russians are coming.
I think in the last few weeks and months it has reached a fever pitch. I mean, we've got the level of media coverage now of this crisis in the Ukraine and Russia's role in it, and Russia's role in Europe, and Putin in particular, has become hysterical and completely unrelated to reality. And I think it is quite dangerous. I think they're whipping up a kind of war fever and preparing people for a level of intervention that, you know, British people in this part of the world, in Western Europe, are actually not committed to at all, nor in the United States. They're trying to lay the ground for a level of action in relation to Russia and the Ukraine that I think is A, unjustified, and B, not at all supported by public opinion. But these things have a momentum of their own. And, you know, in the last few weeks, we've seen decisions to send American and British troops in relatively small numbers, we're talking hundreds, but still troops, to Ukraine, which is
to
not
the front line,
which is not a member of NATO, to a zone where there is conflict, in which there's a civil war going on, which Russia is supporting one side in that war, and the United States, Britain, France, and the other NATO powers are supporting the other side, a government that came to power in an illegal overthrow of an elected government. And this is a dangerous situation which can spin out of control. So I think it's necessary for us in this part of the world to be actually much tougher with our own governments and our own military and our own media about the stories they're telling about this situation, because it's something that can lead to disaster.
Well, 100 years ago, it did. We got into the First World War because if we didn't do this now, we wouldn't be able to do it later. And it was like a train, really. The war occurred because of timetables, railway timetables. I spoke yesterday in Parliament to Colonel Bob Stewart, former British military commander, now a member of Parliament, and I pointed out to him the rather obvious point, ought to be obvious to him more than anyone, that this confrontation with Russia is, well, a trifle dangerous. Because if it gets hot, if the shooting starts, this is not Yugoslavia you're talking about. Neither is it Iraq. Russia is a nuclear-armed superpower in which the vast majority of the people in the state are behind the government in the stand that they're taking. Is it really dangerous? Can it turn hot?
I don't think it's the intention of either the Western powers nor the Russian government for that to happen. I don't think the West intends to fight in Ukraine, although it's clearly drawn the line in the NATO states that it's set up in the former Soviet Union, particularly the Baltic states. But as we're talking about, these things have their own logic and they can lead to their own forms of escalation. If, for example, as there is incredibly strong pressure in the US from both main parties, Republicans and Democrats, to arm the Ukrainian government, which has been resisted up to this point by France and Germany in particular. If that takes place and they send heavy weapons to the Ukrainian forces, by the way, which include fascist militias fighting on the front line in eastern Ukraine with names like the Azov Battalion, where they have swastika-like symbols on their arms and belief in racial superiority and white supremacy. These are some of the forces that we're talking about arming and supporting, that the West is supporting at the moment. If that happens, and the Russians then increase the level of supplies with heavier weapons to the rebel camp in eastern Ukraine, the potential for that conflict spinning out of control is very serious. And in fact, we've had British generals, like the former British representative at NATO, who's been speaking out in the last week, saying just this, that the potential for what he called total war is there. And his argument is, that the British government, NATO, must take this more seriously, that military spending must be increased. And a lot of people are using this conflict as a way to try and protect the army and the armed forces from cuts and to, spend more on weapons. But, if people like that themselves are saying it, I think we should take it seriously and wind down the conflict and raise the pressure in this country and other parts of the world to wind down this conflict, to de-escalate the conflict. We've got to, at the moment, there's a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, which is more or less holding, and that some of the heavy weapons have been pulled back from the front line as a result of this so-called Minsk agreement that was signed last month. But the sending of troops by Britain and America to Ukraine, to Kiev, actually explicitly breaks that agreement that was signed, the ceasefire agreement. But Article 10 in that ceasefire agreement, the Minsk agreement, stipulates withdrawal of all foreign forces from Ukraine. Yeah. Right. And that is being breached by our own government, by the United States government directly. But, that agreement is likely to break down again because it doesn't deal with the underlying causes, and we're likely to see a new escalation in the months to come. So we need to be promoting, I think, quite seriously and pressing for an alternative and an end to this ludicrous anti-Russian propaganda, which is blinding to people to the reality of what's going on and making a genuine debate and dialogue about what's taking place impossible. Because anything that contradicts the NATO line and the Western line, which overwhelmingly dominates the Western media, is immediately dismissed as Kremlin propaganda. Yeah. Whatever the truth of it. Now, actually, in terms of the stance that he's taken in relation to the Ukraine, Putin is in many ways a sort of centrist figure, balancing the factions on different sides and the pressures on different sides. The majority of people in Russia, I think not just from opinion polls, but from all sorts of other evidence, in many cases would like a tougher position and stronger support. And of course, the rebels themselves in eastern Ukraine, many of them believe that Russia is not offering nearly enough support. But I think that just reflects the fact that Russia has been pushed back and back and back in the past 25 years, 20 years since the end of the Cold War, that commitments that were made, and they were made, the records in the American archives show that NATO would not be expanded to the east, were broken. And NATO was pushed right up against the Russian border into the former Soviet Union. And in the end, Putin has drawn a line on that, and he drew it first in Georgia in 2008, and again in this conflict in the Ukraine, where the West intervened to support the overthrow, the anti-constitutional overthrow of the elected government a year ago. which created this crisis and triggered the rebellion in the east of the country. And that's something which clearly has the support of the majority of people in Russia and, of course, many people in the Ukraine.
This joker from NATO, I debated him in the Hay on Wye festival, the How the Light Gets In festival. And he had only days before been Britain's representative on the NATO military command. And he explicitly said that British people have to get used to the fact that their sons may have to die in Latvia because that is now our front line. The audience was quite startled, most of whom couldn't have placed Latvia anywhere on the map. And yet, in a way, Britain is sleepwalking into this position. Shouldn't we start a no war with Russia campaign or Stop the War Coalition really take on this subject? Otherwise, we might end up in the war to the mother of all wars.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very dangerous situation. The Baltic states were incorporated into NATO, and now it's said by defenders of NATO and NATO itself that they have every right to join whichever alliance they wish to, which of course at the technical level is true, but that alliance doesn't have to accept them as members, and it has impact on other states in the region, of course.
Wouldn't have worked if the Republic of Ireland had joined the Warsaw Pact when it existed.
I think you're right, and so what's really needed in Europe is an overarching security system that includes everybody, including Russia, that doesn't exclude actually the biggest country in Europe, but creates a genuine security system for everybody and winds down these confrontations rather than winding them up. We don't want to be in a confrontation with Russia over the Baltic states, and there's no need for that, whatever. It is NATO's existence which is creating these conflicts and its expansion to the east. So I think we need to ring the bell on this and sound the alarm, because it is running out of control and it can go somewhere which nobody wants on either side of this confrontation.
Very briefly then, what's it all about? Russia's not a communist country. Putin is not a communist. Russia is a capitalist economy like all others in Europe. What's the real reason behind this belligerence towards Russia, towards Putin?
Well, I think it does come down to this drive by the United States and its allies to use the collapse of the Soviet Union to take control of the continent, to ensure that American power is embedded into the European system indefinitely. And that was something that was specifically laid out by the United States government in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We've got the documents showing that. And it's also in the case of Ukraine. It's been a prize, as the Americans have said, for decades to effectively get control of Ukraine, because Ukraine is economically, although it's a basket case at the moment, it has huge economic potential and always has had, and allied with Russia, or part of a wider bloc, including Russia, gives Russia more strength than the United States and its allies want to see it have. In the end, this is about the attempt to maintain a unipolar world, or an American and Western-dominated order, which has broken down in the last few years, and that's what's created, I think, some of this conflict. But from the point of view of most people in the world, they want to see a multipolar order. They don't want to see a global system dominated by one power and its allies, which overwhelmingly dominates the world militarily. And that's something we're seeing played out in these conflicts.
Seamus Milne, thank God for you.
A bit of Christmas tree diplomacy. When Notre Dame Cathedral said it was unable to raise enough funds for the tree, Moscow stumped up $100,000 to transport it and install the 25-metre tree in Paris. It's a message of peace, said the Russian ambassador. It's also another example of Putin's campaign to garner influence across Europe. Earlier, a Moscow-based bank lent Marine Le Pen's cash-strapped far-right Front National party $11 million. And all of this goodwill coming just days after France refused to deliver 2 warships to Russia because of Moscow's involvement in Ukraine. The Kremlin quickly pulled back from a threat of serious consequences if France reneged on the deal. But it's more than Christmas trees and cash. At the G20 in Brisbane, Vladimir Putin couldn't fail to be aware of Russia's growing isolation. And the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, once the West's contact point with Putin, has finally run out of patience, and Putin is now paying court to the countries on the margins of Europe, looking to shore up old alliances. In Serbia, Russian forces on manoeuvres with the Serbian army, the first joint drill with a country seeking membership in the EU. It rang alarm bells in Brussels, but it's an indication of Russia's determination to extend its sphere of influence across the countries on its borders. And Russia's financial and economic investments within Europe are extensive. Bulgaria, $11 billion has been invested by Russia over the last 10 years. Italy, Russia's the country's main energy supplier. Hungary negotiated secret loans with Russia totaling $12 billion at below market rates. And Austria imports 60% of its gas from Russia. Moscow's invested $12 billion in the country.
It's essentially for Kremlin to have countries inside European Union. He would try to block sanctions. But the main battle which Putin lost in Europe is battle for Madame Merkel's heart. You know that especially after their 5 hours meeting in Brisbane, she's now just furious about Putin.
The German Chancellor delivered this stark warning about Putin's territorial ambitions in a speech following the G20 in Brisbane last month. This isn't just about Ukraine, she said. This is about Moldova, about Georgia, and if this continues, we'll have to ask about Serbia. Well, the view from Washington and Brussels is that President Putin is busy bullying, buying and bribing his way into extending Russia's influence and power in the EU. And the Kremlin's perception of this so-called crisis? Well, it's convinced that EU's remorseless move towards the countries of Eastern Europe represents a threat to Russian security. Where the EU goes, they'll tell you, NATO will follow. Peter Sharp, Al Jazeera in Moscow.
Defending against Vladimir Putin's Russian military aggression is about to get harder. The head of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, warning a new generation of Russian cruise missiles could strike critical military radars and missiles inside the United States.
The development of the cruise missiles that they have that have a very long range, that from eastern Russia, they can range critical infrastructure in Alaska and in Canada that we rely on for a homeland defense mission.
This is the missile, the KH-101. It's a non-nuclear, long-range cruise missile now in the final stages of Russian development. Its 2,000-mile-plus range gives the Russians the ability to fire from near their own coastline. It's highly precise, flies low, and is difficult to detect.
If we don't have the ability to detect it, we can't defend against it.
That means not just Alaska is at risk, but even the eastern United States from potential missile launches in the Atlantic. Russia already has doubled its long-range Bear bomber patrols around U.S. coastlines in the last year. Now 10 a year, more than 100 around Europe, the most flights since the Cold War. In the last month, several U.S. officials publicly sounding warning.
Russia's provocations are only more worrisome in light of Vladimir Putin's intense focus on building up and modernizing Russia's military forces.
The top U.S. commander in Europe even raising nuclear weapons concerns.
There are those dual-use weapon systems that could very easily be nuclear or non-nuclear, and our ability to tell the difference between one and the other is very tough, and this is very worrisome.
A couple of weeks ago, the idea of a Russian military intervention in Ukraine seemed unthinkable. Well, the arrival of Russian troops in Crimea last weekend has shown the world that the Russian president is willing to embark on reckless adventures on the EU's doorstep. How should the European Union react and respond to Vladimir Putin's new confrontational style? This is our brand new studio at the European Parliament in Brussels. Welcome to Talking Europe. And Let me introduce you to my guest today, Charles Tannock. Welcome to Talking Europe. You're a British MEP from the Conservatives and Reformists. You're the Conservative coordinator on the Foreign Affairs Committee here at the European Parliament. Also with us, Tatjana Ždanoc. Welcome. You're a Latvian MEP from the group of the Greens / European Free Alliance. Now, you belong to a Latvian party that represents your country's large Russian-speaking community.
Yeah.
And also with us, Marek Żywiec. You're from Poland, from the group of Socialists and Democrats, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and of the EU-Ukraine delegation. You also served as a chair of this delegation. Let me start with you, Charles Tannock. What was the view from London? Is this a new Cold War?
Well, my view and my group's view is that this, as a result of brazen aggression by Putin, I don't think all of Russia, because the majority of Russians don't necessarily agree with him, Putin has decided to capitalize on the chaos and confusion after a revolutionary situation and basically move his troops into Crimea, and on a pack of lies and disinformation and massive black propaganda from the whole machinery behind him in the Kremlin to try and take over territory of the Republic of Ukraine. And it's a violation of international law, the UN Charter, the OSCE understandings, and the Budapest assurances to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. It's an absolute outrage, and he mustn't be allowed to get away with it, in my view.
Tatjana Ždanoc, you heard how Europe, how the United States condemned what they regard as a gross aggression and violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity. What do you respond?
I think the whole story of Ukraine's secession started a little bit earlier. We can start with September, but in October, when Yanukovych was ready to sign the association agreement, the European Parliament passed the resolution. Two big political groups voted in favor, EPP, Socialists, that in fact announcing Cold War against Russia. The wording of critical engagement, which was before then used for Belarus only, was used. So
what is it
a problem.
specifically
Who
in the
has
wording that
announced
you call
this Cold War?
What is it in the wording that you thought heralded a new Cold War?
Strategic partnership would be the good answer, but unfortunately the whole story of Eastern Partnership was investigated to prolongate this thinking of the Cold War.
I think it would be much easier to discuss around this table if Madame Ždanoc come back from the virtual reality to the real world. And actually I'm in the Parliament every session, and I cannot remember any aggressive or unfriendly wording focused against Russia.
You're telling us this partnership with Ukraine was not against Russia?
There was no threat to Russia whatsoever.
This is obvious. There were never any questions. Russia had no interest in the Eastern Partnership since the beginning. I understand why, but this is the truth. So if we start to describe the reality, real reality, we cannot escape from basic facts. The basic facts are that legal Ukrainian president refused to sign association, and he had the right to do that. And the second fact is that the massive opposition came out and the Maidan has begun, and people didn't like this decision, and nobody explained them why this decision was taken. And then the massive violence against these people has begun, and hundreds of people were killed, and these are facts, and we cannot, describing the situation, escape from this simple reality.
The problem
Madame
of Yanukovych was that he misled
I don't know what is your problem. I don't know what is your
his party explained
Before you start to speak about Yanukovych, try to describe your problem and come back to the reality.
The whole story and the whole problem is the dissolution of this immediate dissolution of one body, of one state, and announcement of 15 national states. It is not the case.
But
the borders were artificially created.
Gorbachev said the miners of the Donbass, who spoke perfect Russian, they voted for independence from Moscow and the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the setting up of a new independent Ukraine. And the problem with people like you and Putin is that you do not wish to recognize that the Soviet Empire is finished, The Tsarist dream is finished. Putin's dream of reconstituting a Soviet empire is not possible. These are independent countries who have a right to determine their own future, and you cannot use the army of Russia to impose the Kremlin's view on the people of Ukraine.
Why do you think that these borders of 15 republics are real ones, and other borders of people, of autonomies, of cultures, of languages?
There are many borders which are not.
Yeah, there are many borders.
Many borders like that. You can't change them by force, Mrs. Dallek.
Let me just step in here.
What remark about the borders? All the borders between all the states created after the Soviet Union were approved by Moscow. Every single piece of the border. So it was decision of Russian Federation, and Yeltsin, who became the first president. Everything with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, every border was approved by Moscow. So don't complain about that. Don't complain.
The Communist Party set them up in the 1930s.
Most of the strategies of people who were sacrificed of this sign of Yeltsin and
Can we just ask, Mrs. Dallek, do you think that the 1930s solution used by Hitler to change borders by military intervention is justified this year in 2014? That is what Putin thinks, and he can go in there with the army and he can take away Crimea, even though it's internationally recognized, included by Russia in the 1994 assurances. They recognize the border.
Included by Khrushchev. You misunderstand what is Russia, what is Moscow.
Independent Russian Federation in 1994 agreed to the borders of Ukraine, including Crimea. You cannot or arbitrarily, by military force, change borders like Putin.
Kiev, you can also say Russia, because Kiev is the capital of Russia. It's a native.
We're not going to rewrite the history of Ukraine here, but I have there is a central question. There is a central question here. There is a large Russian-speaking community in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin says that following the events in Ukraine, these people are no longer represented in Kiev under the new authorities. This is how you feel about the new government? You feel that it's not inclusive?
The Ukraine is respecting all the rules of Council of Europe, including these who are protecting the minority, who are protecting the rights of minority, including culture, language, and so on. And you know what is interesting? That never, I follow the Ukrainian political language. Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, they were never called minority because they are on equal level with all the Ukrainians living in the country. I visited many times the east of Ukraine, where Russian is a language on the street.
I want to ask you, what should Europe do at this stage of the crisis? We heard sanctions, visa bans,
asset freezes.
What is the best way to tackle and to convince Mr. Putin that, as you say, he's wrong and he should change his mind?
They are not the partners for diplomacy. I'm a big supporter of a peaceful solution, but to have a peaceful solution, we need to withdraw Russian from the Crimea, which is not possible because they are playing totally different scenario.
You know the Russians very well. The threat of sanctions, visa bans, this can work. This can be productive.
This can work against Europe. It will work, and someone is just wanting that Europe is weakening by all these events taking place here. And the whole story of Eastern Partnership was a story of weakening Europe, of creating artificial barriers instead of creating strategic partnership.
You don't believe that Russian oligarchs, after a while, when they feel that their residence in London or their accounts in Switzerland are being threatened, will tell Mr. Putin, you are making a mistake.
Maybe it's better thing to leave them in London, let them live in London.
The president is highly dependent on these people.
But the step of Ukrainian authorities to push as a governors in Russian-speaking regions, Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, former allies of Yanukovych, oligarchs, is showing whether this government is really want to fulfill the willingness of Maidan to struggle against corruption.
Can I say that, first of all, sanctions clearly do work to a certain to an extent, because it was clear that when Yanukovych's oligarchs felt in danger of their assets being frozen, they rapidly switched sides. They instructed many of the party of the regions to no longer...
Referring to Rinat Akhmetov?
So Akhmetov, Firtash and others, they rapidly switched sides, and it was very effective. Now, whether that will work with the Russian oligarchs, I don't know. But I do know that Putin is sensitive about what the world thinks about him. He was clearly demonstrating that during the Sochi Olympics. If he becomes an international pariah and is seen as some kind of military warmonger and start to move his army across into eastern Ukraine, there will have to be very, very tough sanctions, not just economic. I would argue, I wrote an article yesterday, the Dardanelles need to be shut down to Russian shipping, the Turks need to be brought on board, the Chinese need to be convinced that Putin's dream is to reconstitute a Soviet empire, and the Soviet empire is not in China's interests and not in the free world's interests either.
Mr. Shivets, the weakness of Europe, though, is that Europe is highly dependent on Russia. Britain has a lot of Russian money. France sells a lot of military equipment. Are we ready? To cut all these ties?
Let's decide what is important: real estate investment in London or Soviet-Russian army in Polish borders, European Union borders, and this is dilemma. And if we discuss how we are how much we depend on Russian energy, let's speak how much they depend on our money. And so if they stop the delivery of the energy, we stop delivery of the money, and
they go bankrupt. The Russian state would go bankrupt. They don't export their gas. They have to sell their gas.
If they want to rebuild the isolation of the Soviet Union in the frontiers of the Russian Federation, okay, let's do that. But I don't believe that 160 million Russian people, they want to live in such a world.
70% of Russian people in the most recent opinion poll are against any kind of military intervention or attacks on Ukraine. And if there is to be a war, and God forbid there isn't, it will be a very bloody war. And Putin will live to regret it, in my view.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you for taking part in this discussion. It was a very heated debate. You agreed to disagree, but we'll be following, of course, the latest developments in Ukraine in our news bulletins.